Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, could I please speak with Maaza Mengiste?
This is her. This is she.
This is she, this is Cher, this is Maaza, this is Paul. Maaza, I love that we're beginning with a good laugh. Maaza, you're on the phone with me for the Quarantine Tapes, and I can't tell you how delighted I am that you accepted our invitation. Now tell me, Maaza, where do I find you, first of all?
I am in New York City. I am in Queens. I have not long ago arrived here from Switzerland, which is where I spent all of the pandemic. I was stuck there.
Right. And what was it like in Switzerland to live the pandemic? You were in Zurich, I believe.
I was in Zurich, Paul. You know, it was a completely different experience. I realize that now because the government there gave clear, precise, concise directions based on science. And they were able to keep numbers down after they seemed to be exploding initially. So the experience there was much more calm than what happened here in New York. And, you know, now that I'm here, that fear, I see it reflected in a way that not even the news could have reflected it back to me. So I understand. I lived in a completely different world in Switzerland, and it was very different being here in New York.
You know, I spoke with a writer and poet, Zjon, an Icelandic writer, and he was saying something that was not dissimilar to your Swiss experience, which is that in Iceland, when the pandemic broke out there, people would, first of all, they did something, as you said, very strange, which is rely on science. But in the news, what he heard all the time was that it was a national sport to flatten the curve. To flatten the curve. Everybody was involved in doing that. And I imagine that being in Switzerland, you must have lived the pandemic in a very different way. And I'm wondering what thoughts came to you there that you think might not have come to you if you had lived all that time in Queens?
You know, that's a really good question. I have to say that initially in those first couple of weeks when no one knew really what was happening, we didn't know anything about this virus. We didn't exactly know how it spread. And it seemed like anything you did could get you sick. I was terrified, you know, even in Switzerland, and just like everyone else. And then the thing that made it so different was you suddenly see people take stock of what they know and begin to say, well, we need to follow the most conservative precautions for this. And the thing that I experienced there was an assurance that things were being dealt with, you know, well, that it was being handled capably. And what was also interesting, Paul, was to see how in tune everyone was there. I'm assuming also across Europe with what was happening here in the United States. But everyone at night would listen to or watch Andrew Cuomo's broadcast there. And I found that also really interesting. I didn't have that continued ongoing panic and confusion being in Zurich, as I think the United States felt, and in many ways is still continuing to feel now.
Right. And in a sense, a follow-up question, Maaza, would be, has this pandemic made you think about some of your persistent interests in a different way? And differently put, what didn't you pay attention to or didn't pay attention to enough before that this pandemic has in a sense brought into focus?
Yeah, there were a set of questions that I was asking myself, and I was asking friends of mine when we would get online. And, one of the persistent questions I think everybody asked was, what will this world look like beyond this?
Yes.
But in private, I started asking myself, what makes happiness? What makes me happy? I started taking stock of moments of joy, those things that gave me a sense of freedom no matter where I was, and no matter what kind of space I happened to find myself in. And I don't think I was the only one that started to say, what really matters now, and how can I make that central to the way that I live? And of course, maybe the most obvious thing is health, again and again. But the one thing I've started to think about is this freedom of mobility that I have taken for granted, most of my life. Suddenly, when you're in lockdown or you're in quarantine, because I was in quarantine once I came back to New York, you really begin to understand the spaces that you live in. And we're not just speaking of physical geographies or physical constraints, but also we become very aware of the mental and emotional constraints that are put on us or have been put on us these past several months. That freedom that we used to take for granted suddenly became very clear to me.
I wonder if you ever took it for granted.
That is also really an interesting comment, because when this pandemic hit, the person that I could speak to who had a very clear understanding of all the conflicting emotions I was living with was a friend of mine who is Egyptian. And she had experienced the revolution in Tahrir Square. And when I called her immediately when they announced the lockdown, and I said, I feel like I'm in the early days of the revolution in Ethiopia, she said, I feel like I'm in the days of Tahrir Square again. And it really felt like a war zone. We were on the brink of something we couldn't see, and we didn't understand what was coming at us. And it made me realize I carried all of that with me, that I have been carrying that with me also. And so that feeling of constriction that I started to feel was, in some ways, felt like a familiar wound rising up to the surface.
Would we know your Egyptian friend?
You would. And I think you did speak to her, Mona El-Tahawi.
I imagined as much. Of course, it's an enchanted circle, but of course you would be bringing this about. And of course you were carrying, Maaza, if I'm correct, you were carrying the very history you had written so beautifully about in the Shadow King, which I'm very happy also to tell all of our listeners will become a movie, which is extraordinary. And I'm thinking also of someone who has mattered to you, I think, quite greatly, and to me too, which is Brayton Braytonbach, who once said to you, sometimes fiction tells a truth that history can't access. Having now followed his advice precisely in writing the two books you've written, having now followed this advice and written fiction, how does that resonate with you at this moment?
Oh, it's...
Sorry.
I have been thinking, this is excellent, because I have been thinking a lot about this in the last few weeks since coming back. The way that fiction addresses history, the way that it confronts history, because I think that the history that we get, which is really which is usually the it's the memory that has been passed down to us from those victors of wars and conquest. And what fiction does is to rewrite that first draft.
Right. The history is so often written from the point of view of victors, and I know in that context you've been thinking again, as one does, about Walter Benjamin and his ideas about history and fascism.
Yeah, and that's exactly this idea that fiction resurrects. And, it brings back those people who were forgotten or meant to be completely erased. And Walter Benjamin said something very interesting, and it's been going around in my head lately. He said, if fascism wins, not even our dead will be safe from the enemy. And, of course, he said this long ago, but in thinking about this, I think of fiction as an act of protecting those who are not born and those who have passed.
He said that a long time ago, but as the great historian Carlo Ginzburg said, fascism has a future.
Yeah. And this is exactly, this act of writing is in some ways a responsibility or a form of justice that we give to those who are either dead or those who are not yet living, those unborn, that future. Because if someone can define the past and tell us who to remember, then they can tell us who we are. And it's been this thing that I have been thinking about, how to shift the way we begin to think of temporal boundaries. That if the past is not the past is right now. The present is now. The future is now. And all those protests and uprisings that are happening are doing the triple work of confronting all of those layers. It makes me think about writing as a form of justice, and it's a form of respect. It's a responsibility that, all of us shoulder, no matter what kind of writing that we do, because who existed before us matters in how we ourselves look at each other and look at who we are in the mirror.
This brings to mind, as we were talking about fiction and the difference between writing fiction and maybe writing history, as it were, and the intertwinedness of both of them. It made me think of, that extraordinary line of June Jordan where she says, poetry is a political act because it involves telling the truth. And I also know, Maaza, that poetry at this moment is keeping you company.
It really is. I think, like everyone else in this lockdown, I found my focus and concentration simply vanished. In those early days, I could pick up a book and I would just stare at words. And so I started going back to the poets. I've read, I read them constantly, but I started doing that, and I realized I realized how profoundly necessary poetry is. I reconfirmed that. I have always felt it, but in that space of the lockdown, when we could not seem to find the right vocabulary to describe what was happening around the world, because we couldn't even predict what would happen the next day. We had no grasp on language. Poetry seemed to be, for me, the language that understood way ahead of time that we would need it in these moments.
Who among the older friends, or perhaps some new friends, did that best for you? And is there a poem, for instance, that captures that for you?
I have a couple. I have been reading several poets at once: Nicole Seeley, John Murillo, Rachel Eliza Griffiths, but Ilya Kaminsky with his Deaf Republic.
Incredible.
This is just a monumental work. And it speaks to now, but it's also absolutely timeless. And I have been going back to this work. And in fact, when I was in Zurich, I took one of my old writing notebooks with me. And what I do when I like a poem or a series of poems, I copy them by hand. And in that notebook were poems of Elia's that I had copied. And because I hadn't packed the book with me, and I just kept reading those poems I had written down again and again.
In your hand?
Yes.
Is there one in particular, Maaza? Maybe you even have that notebook. Is there one in particular that speaks to you and resonates for this moment?
Yes, I think there's one in here. It's called "Such is the Story Made of Stubbornness and a Little Air," and it's elegiac and simply stunning.
I'm all ears.
Oh, really? Okay, so I will read it.
Please.
Okay. Such is the story made of stubbornness and a little air. A story signed by those who danced wordless before God, who whirled and leapt, giving voice to consonants that rise with no protection but each other's ears. We are on our bellies in this quiet, Lord. Let us wash our faces in the wind and forget the strict shapes of affection. Let the pregnant woman hold something of clay in her hand. She believes in God, yes, but also in the mothers of her country who take off their shoes and walk. Their footsteps erase our syntax. Let her man kneel on the roof, clearing his throat, for the secret of patience is his wife's patience. He who loves roofs tonight and tonight, making love to her and to her forgetting. Let them borrow the light from the blind. There will be evidence. While helicopters bomb the street, whatever they will open. What is silence? Something of the sky in us. And I have loved this. What is silence? Something of the sky in us.
And to her forgetting.
Yes. And this whole book is really an anthem to memory and grief, but also to courage and beauty and resistance. And I have relied on it throughout.
Maaza, you once said that Ethiopia is a country that raises fundamental questions about freedom, such as what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be independent? How are we defining independence? How do we understand freedom of expression? Is freedom just about economic growth? Is that the way we decide to measure democracy or our progress in the country? What do those words of yours said a while ago mean to you now?
You know, Paul, I was speaking of Ethiopia, but really I could have been speaking of the United States right now.
Precisely.
It is, we speak of nations. We used to speak of nations, and I think now we're really speaking of power. And we're speaking of authoritarianism and these concepts, these ways of speaking of countries. How do I explain this? I can speak of Ethiopia, but really I'm speaking of America, but really I'm speaking of authoritarianism and power. And the borders are becoming obliterated because we're seeing a rise in a different kind of, not a new kind, but another kind of governance. And it echoes fascism, it echoes dictatorships that have existed. And we're seeing it here in the United States. And I think that the ways of speaking about America have startled many people because we're not used to speaking of America in terms of non-freedoms.
Right.
This was a country that represented freedom. And now it's representing the collapse of democracy.
What?
And in order to believe that actually is happening, you have to readjust your whole sense of history.
That made me think about the moment you describe, Maaza. I felt I was nearly with you watching television in Zurich about America.
It was when I was in Zurich and I was watching, the George Floyd was murdered while I was there. And I could not, and I have not been able to watch that video. But in reading all the commentaries and looking at the interviews and made by his family members, seeing the protests, I took part in protests in Zurich as well. It made me realize in Zurich, this is not the way things have to be. In this country, it's almost a fait accompli. We just say, well, this is just how it is, and we've got to fight this. And, it is how it is. But it doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
And that when friends of mine here in New York are telling me that in the rural areas across this state and through Connecticut and through Vermont, there are gun shops that have run out of ammunition and weapons. It's such a stark difference from Zurich, where no one's speaking of guns. No one is thinking of stocking up on ammunition. For what? I kept seeing those differences, and the world we live in here in the United States does not have to be this way. It is not inevitable, and I see those protesters as groups of people who are trying to push against the belief that, well, we really can't do anything. This is just how it is.
Every day I've noticed you post on Twitter. A day since Breonna Taylor was killed. Why?
I did that. I started that because I thought, well, surely they're going to at least indict these murderers. But I'm going to post this because it's on my mind. And then the next day, nothing would happen. And the next day, nothing happened. And so I would keep posting. And I don't know if anyone is really paying attention. Once in a while, I think people see it. But a lot of times they don't. And then there was a moment when I don't know how long I had been doing this, but I said, let me just click back to all my posts. And I started going through them, clicking one day, then the day before comes up, and I'll click that, and the day before comes up, and I'll click that. And I started going through, and the enormity of that silence, the lack of arrest, spoke volumes to me. It shook me to see the way that, I guess this brings back Walter, Benjamin. If fascism wins, not even our dead will be safe from the enemy. This is a young woman who is now dead, and slowly she's in the process of being erased and being disappeared after she has been murdered.
Depending who ends up being a victor.
Yes, absolutely. And I think... Go ahead.
Maaza, you've been interested so much in the role of images in our society.
Yeah.
How have you been thinking about that interest in this moment where we're spending so much time on our screens? And connected to that question, I just had the immense pleasure of looking at your project 3541, an archive of stories and photographs. And connected to my first questions, what are you trying with that to achieve?
This is, thinking about the way that we are bombarded with these images, with these videos. You and I are talking as Jacob Blake lies paralyzed in his hospital bed from gunshots. We don't know if he'll walk again. He was shot 7 times by police. That video went around the world. We're glued to our screens, like you said, and this pandemic is really, we're either on our computer screens or we might be on our television screens, watching a movie or something. But it makes me wonder, and this is a question I've been asking about the photographs that I collect from the 30s. What are we really seeing of these human beings?
Right.
What is it that we are supposed to recognize that the person who was taking that photograph or making that video didn't intend for us to see because they couldn't see it as well? And I think it's one of the reasons I started that project 3541, how can these photographs of people who were subjugated by a colonial or colonizing force, how can these photographs taken by those colonizing soldiers, what can those photographs reveal about the subject, but also what can it tell us about the photographer? And I'm really interested in the way that these images reflect back on the person photographing. Because if the person in power, if the person who is taking an image, making an image, has power over the person who is being photographed, that photograph is a reflection back on the photographer. It's a language of power that's being spoken. And I'm fascinated by these photographs because I'd like to understand what it's saying about who has power, who does not, and how those of us who are looking years later can in some ways restore the person who is in that image. How can we recognize their agency, their worth, even when we were not supposed to? And I think this goes back again to what Walter Benjamin was saying, that if our dead, will not be safe from the enemy, if they were not safe, what can the living do to restore some of that respect?
One of the ways in which they can restore that is through many of the struggles that are happening now, when people say their name, just naming, which I think is what you do with your Breonna Taylor posting every day. And I'm thinking also about the great words of Gordon Parks, who said, "I saw that the camera could be a weapon against poverty, against racism, against all sorts of social wrongs. I knew at that point I had to have a camera." And in a way, you are saying, I have to have a pen.
Yeah, it makes me think about, there's this line in Agamemnon, the one by Aeschylus, when Cassandra, she knows Agamemnon is about to be killed, and she's talking to the chorus, and she's been cursed with the gift of sight, but being able to see the future, but no one will believe her. This is what Apollo, it's a curse that Apollo placed on her, and she's trying to tell the chorus that Clytemnestra is going to kill Agamemnon. I am not safe here. And the chorus doesn't want to believe her, and she is this person who's bearing witness to events even before they happen, and there's nothing she can do. And at some point, something clicks with what she said. And the chorus says, "But you amaze me, bred across the sea, your language strange, and still you sense the truth as if you had been here." And when I read that, I wrote down those lines, and in every notebook, I write by hand. In every notebook I have, that's the opening page. And it struck me, your language strange, and still you sense the truth as if you had been here. This sense, this idea that when we look at something, as futile as it might seem, as difficult as it might seem to make people understand what it is that we are trying to get across, there will be a point when, going back to Ilya Kaminsky, the sky will break open, and the sky will be in us also. That line has stayed with me for a very long time.
Maaza, what a pleasure to speak to you. I wish we had the whole day, as it were. It's been such a joy to speak to you, and I hope before long we meet again in person. In the meantime, take good care of yourself, and I can't wait to see on the big screen, hopefully in a movie theater, The Shadow King. And for all those people listening, please read Maaza Mengiste. All the best to you.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Take good care. Bye-bye.
You too, Paul. Thank you. Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.